Hi there, welcome to the program. Joining me on the panel tonight, journalist and researcher Vicky Xu, the new chair of Parliament's Powerful Intelligence and Security Committee, James Patterson, President of the Australia-China Business Council, David Olsen, the Shadow Minister for Finance, Katie Gallagher, and Coronacast host Dr. Norman Swan. Please make all of them feel welcome.
With the information that tens of millions of dollars were paid in bonuses to Australian public servants during the same period the Australian Post team received their watches, why can't Scott Morrison just man up and apologise to Christine Holgate? He would gain more respect if he did.
Senator Patterson.
I've got a lot of empathy for Christine Holgate because going through what she went through, being in the eye of a media storm, is a horrible thing to experience. And I have a bit of a different perspective to you, though, on the Prime Minister's involvement, because 4 years ago I was the Parliamentary Committee Chair that revealed her predecessor as Australia Post CEO, Ahmed Fahour's salary. It was a pretty horrible time for him too. And I did so because I thought it was an important principle of transparency, that taxpayers are entitled to know what the senior executives at a public entity are paid. He was on the front page of newspapers, and it ultimately led to his early retirement from that role. Now, at the time, no one said it was a gendered criticism because he was a man, and I don't remember anyone saying it was bullying either. They just thought it was appropriate scrutiny for a public servant, effectively. And I think the same is the case for Christine Holgate. I think it was inappropriate expenditure of taxpayers' money to hand out luxury watches to already very well-paid people. And I was also concerned to hear Christine Holgate say before the Senate committee that she wasn't spending taxpayers' money. Australia Post was established by taxpayers, it has been legislated by taxpayers, it is owned by taxpayers, and every dollar of profit that it earns is remitted to taxpayers. So if they're spending it on luxury watches, that's money that doesn't go to taxpayers. And 4 years into her reign as CEO, that she didn't understand what comes with running a public entity was of concern to me.
But let's just be clear, she's not asking for an apology because of the scrutiny, she's asking for an apology because of the way the Prime Minister treated her on the floor of the Parliament. That's a very different thing.
Well, I don't actually think it is that different, Hamish. I think the Prime Minister was reflecting the frustration that a lot of Australians would hear when they heard that already very highly paid public servants were further awarding themselves with taxpayers' money with expensive watches that most Australian taxpayers would never be able to afford to buy themselves. If you make decisions like that...
So it's okay in that circumstance to stand up in the Parliament and do what he did?
Well, what he did was stand up in the Parliament and say there will be an investigation, and that if Ms Holgate didn't want to stand aside while that investigation took place, she should go. Now, she did stand aside. That was the appropriate thing to do.
It was pretty aggressive. You acknowledge that?
It was very strong, and I think it reflected the sentiment at the time. It reflected the tone of the questions asked by Labor senators in estimates, which revealed this expenditure. It reflected the tone of the question that Anthony Albanese asked as opposition leader to the Prime Minister in question time, and indeed Mr Albanese's statement that Christine Holgate's position was untenable before she decided to resign.
So no need for an apology, Katie Gallagher?
Well, I think there is a need for an apology, and I think the difference with what James has just said is in relation to the previous Chief Executive of Australia Post. He wasn't summarily sacked on the floor of Parliament in broad daylight on national TV without the benefit of any investigation. The investigation came later. The investigation essentially cleared Ms Holgate. And I think what we saw from the Prime Minister that day is what happens, and we've seen it a few times now, is when he gets challenged, when he gets under pressure, he gets angry, he overshoots. And I think Ms Holgate deserves an apology. And I say that having said, and Labor has acknowledged, that we didn't think it was appropriate that Cartier watches be given as bonuses to those executives. And that was uncovered at Senate estimates. But the treatment of her since then has been appalling. And the fact that it ended up with her in front of a Senate committee having to kind of give her side of the story goes to show just how broken down the relationship became between the government and a senior official of a GBE managed by shareholders of government ministers.
So you're saying the Prime Minister should apologise. What did he do that Anthony Albanese didn't do?
Well, the Prime Minister, no one forced the Prime Minister to say she has to go, she should leave, she should stand aside, and if she doesn't, she should go in an angry, aggressive manner in question time. Now, Anthony Albanese said there should be consequences for the Cartier watches, and we're not walking away from that. We think there should. We don't think they should have been given. And he said her position has become untenable, and it has become untenable when you've got the chief shareholder, Prime Minister, on the floor of the parliament saying she's got to go. I don't know how you would come back from that. I don't think there is a world where someone in that position could come back once the confidence of the Prime Minister's clearly been lost.
Vicky Shue, does it look like bullying to you when the Prime Minister stands up on the floor of the Parliament and does that?
Well, it certainly does, and I agree with Katie that I think an apology is owed. And
Why?
I think,
Why?
well, the Prime Minister has half said it. You know, he regrets that Christine is treated in such a way. But from what I can see, it's a half apology, and from what I can see, the way she's essentially fired on the Parliament floor, it is not fair treatment. Due process wasn't given to her, and from my perspective as some kind of an outsider, I think this country prides itself in having due process, in treating people fairly, and I think because of that, yes.
It's true, isn't it, Senator Patterson? There was no due process for Christine Holgate in that circumstance.
I don't agree. There was an independent inquiry, and I disagree with Katie's characterisation of it. It didn't exonerate Christine Holgate. It found that her expenditure on these watches was inappropriate use of taxpayers' money. It didn't find that she was guilty of fraud or anything like that.
But
she
what
wasn't
was the due
accused of
process when the
fraud.
PM stood up and said what he said?
Well, I think he was reflecting how a lot of Australians feel, and I think it's
But
appropriate.
that's a different thing to due process, isn't it?
No, well, I think it's appropriate that the Prime Minister reflect the way Australians feel. They look to him as their leader to demonstrate he understands how they feel about these issues. I think he was right to do so. There was an independent inquiry. It did find issues with her management of Australia Post, and particularly expenditure of the executive team. It wasn't just watches, but there were other instances publicly reported of inappropriate spending.
But isn't that the problem with politics today, is that leaders reflect the population rather than lead it? And actually create an example?
Undoubtedly, you want politicians to lead, but you also don't want politicians to be out of touch and to be cold to the sentiment of the Australian people. We're democratically elected, and we have to understand and represent the people that send us there. And I think it's dangerous if we turn ourselves into contemptuous about it.
David Olsen, as a business executive, did it look like due process to you?
Well, I thought the whole process was very disappointing. We're living in a world at the moment where there are so many tensions, problems and issues, and to look at our national parliament and see this sort of behaviour taking place is extremely disappointing. It's not setting an example for us in the world, and we need to do better, frankly. I hesitated to say this before, but I think this is a case of workplace bullying. There's a lot of issues that are being addressed here. There are gender issues, there are governance issues, there are political issues. It's a cauldron.
Are you talking about the Prime Minister?
I'm talking about the issue around Christine Holgate broadly, the way it came up, the way it was dealt with, and the process around the whole thing. And I think none of us would expect our senior political leaders to treat an issue like this in the way in which it was done. Where's the civility? I think there could have been a far better process to take this outside the scope of the floor of the House and deal with it more appropriately.
Would it be acceptable in a corporate environment?
No, absolutely not. But the private sector has nailed this. We understand what a workplace environment should look like. We have rules and processes, and most businesses now, if they're not compliant, they have a process to rectify it. I don't see that process being implemented right now in the Houses of Parliament.
I'm a healthcare worker and have been offered the AstraZeneca vaccine. On paper, I am all for vaccines and have advocated for the COVID vaccine in conversations amongst friends. However, I find myself feeling hesitant about receiving it. I'm especially concerned about potential effects on fertility, as I hope to have more children. The recent incidence of blood clots in younger people has strengthened these feelings of hesitation. What's to say that there won't be more long-term side effects revealed over time? Can I afford to wait a little bit longer to watch what happens in other countries, especially given Australia's relatively low prevalence of the virus?
Norman Swan.
So, vaccine hesitancy, as opposed to being an anti-vaxxer, is entirely understandable, and your concerns are rational, so they're not irrational at all. So let's pick it off one by one. It was put about for a while that there was a problem likely with fertility with these vaccines, because at some point there was a theoretical cross-reaction with a placental antibody or something like that. And there's no evidence of that. If that had been the case, There would have been more problems early on with miscarriages, for example, and there hadn't been those cases, even though there hasn't been a trial on pregnant women. It's true that as time goes on, you can find out long-term effects. The reality with these vaccines is that they've actually been approved at round about the same point of study as most other vaccines have been in the past. It's just that it's all happened quickly because there have been so many people able to be recruited to trials. The clots, but the 780 million people have been immunised now. So it's a lot of vaccines out there, albeit in a short space of time. So the problem that has emerged is this clotting problem with Astra. And I think that if you're under 50, you've got to give it some serious consideration. And potentially today there's a third case. And I think people don't understand why they came to the conclusion they did. And there's two moving parts here. One is we're in a country, or three moving parts. We're in a country that doesn't have any COVID effectively, apart from it's coming in. As you get younger, your risk of dying of COVID diminishes quite rapidly, but also the risk from the vaccine seems to go up. And where the balance seems to lie is around about the age of 50. So you are well under 50. So for you in a country where there's not much COVID around, if you're uncomfortable about that risk, which is probably round about 1 in 200,000, you should wait. And wait until you can get the Pfizer vaccine or the Nova vaccine or one of the others. There's no rush for somebody like you. I get a lot of questions from people who are healthcare workers who are in their 30s and say, well, why can't I have the Astra vaccine? I know the risks, I'm prepared to take it. And that's a rational position too, because the risks are incredibly low. And if you want to get protected and feel comfortable, go ahead and have it. My gripe is that there should be Pfizer available for you now as a young healthcare worker.
I just want to bring Senator Patterson in on that. Why isn't there Pfizer available for a young healthcare worker now?
Well, there will be very soon, but like everyone else in the world, we're scrambling to get as much vaccines as we can. There's only about 10 countries in the world that have sovereign manufacturing capability for vaccines. We're one of them, and so far we've been producing AstraZeneca domestically. We haven't been producing Pfizer domestically, although that's a possibility down the track. So every other country in the world, the 180 other countries in the world, are just trying to get as much vaccine as they can, and they're reliant on imports.
Can I just pick up on that? Are you saying that we should be manufacturing the mRNA vaccines here?
I'm saying it should be looked at, and it will be looked at, and if it's possible, I'm sure we'll do it. At the moment, the capacity
why isn't it already being looked at?
Well, these things are being examined on a daily, hourly basis, Hamish. At the moment, the capacity we've got with CSL in Melbourne is to produce AstraZeneca vaccine, but CSL has publicly said, in fact, before the COVID committee that Katie and I sit on, that they're open to seeing if they can manufacture other vaccines. There's different technologies involved, different capabilities involved. It's not a straightforward thing to do. It's just flick a switch, but it is possible.
It takes
the
about a
facts
year,
are
doesn't it?
that Pfizer knocked on the door of the government last June, saying, what do you want? When do you want it? There was a meeting, and I'm not sure what happened at it, on the 10th of July, and a deal wasn't done until the end of November. What happened in those 4 or 5 months when Britain was doing deals with Pfizer, America was doing deals with Pfizer, and other countries were too? We didn't. And so we came to the party late when Pfizer had already committed its doses. So we could have had Pfizer, but we chose clearly not to.
Well, just in response to that, we already have some doses of Pfizer. They've already been administered to Australians, so it's inaccurate to say we don't have it.
But we're still giving it to aged care who don't need it. They could have Astra safely and be very effectively covered, and we're still going to aged care. And young healthcare workers, we're not saving every Pfizer dose for young healthcare workers at the moment.
We have secured 40 million doses of Pfizer, which will be available throughout this year. But it is understandable why other countries who have suffered much more widespread community transmission than us are prioritising vaccinating their own populations with vaccines like Pfizer rather than allowing them to be exported. I'm disappointed that the European Union has blocked exports of AstraZeneca, but as it turned out, it's the Pfizer vaccine which will be more useful for younger Australians, and they will be tended to be vaccinated much later than older Australians anyway. So
but why are we not prioritising the Pfizer that we have here now for people like Jessica?
The people most at risk of dying from COVID are older Australians, and
Astra protects them really well.
If you let me finish, Norman, the Pfizer vaccine can be given to people 21 days apart, the first and second dose. The AstraZeneca vaccine has to be given to people 12 weeks apart. And so if you're an elderly person in a nursing home, we want to get you protected as soon as possible. So it is quicker to protect you with Pfizer than it is AstraZeneca, and that's the reason why it's still being deployed there.
Okay, I just want to bring in another person from our audience, Jared. You're an aged care worker, is that right?
Yes, I am.
And how old are you?
I'm 20.
And how has it been getting information and access to the vaccine?
The information I've got has pretty much been non-existent. And I know it's really hard for me and some of my colleagues who we watch press conferences all the time with the Prime Minister and the Chief Medical Officer who are constantly saying, we're getting vaccines out to everybody who needs them, but I know myself and many people who are in phase 1A, and 6 weeks later, I still had no notification of when I would be eligible to get a vaccine.
So you've, I think, had now one dose of Astra?
Yes. So after I was notified by my manager that they had been told that they still don't know when they're getting the vaccines, it was suggested to us, everybody who worked in my home, that we go out and book an appointment with our GP or at a vaccination hub, so that's what I did.
Okay. And do you know when you're getting your second one?
Well, I've got it booked in for, I think, in about 10 weeks now.
But do you want to get it, given the advice on AstraZeneca for people under
I don't know.
50?
I'm still undecided.
This is very confusing, Norman Swan.
Yeah, so the problem here is, and this is independent of party politics, the Commonwealth government never runs anything in health. So you can't press a button and stuff happens. It's the states where you can press a button. They don't control general practitioners or independent practitioners. So what they did was they commissioned private organisations to go into aged care homes. And bizarrely, they go into aged care homes and they don't immunise the aged care workers. They're told to go and see their GP. You know, my view is you need 20 Israelis in here to run, vaccination and, turn on a sixpence.
Just for context, those watching, Israel has done a pretty phenomenal job at the rollout of the vaccine, right?
But yeah, I mean, it's a facetious comment, but nonetheless, the problem is we haven't been flexible. We haven't been agile, and the Commonwealth, and I do believe this is political, the Commonwealth has been telling states what to do, organising the vaccines, procuring. The Commonwealth, again, independent of party politics, is not good at procurement. And states are. If the Commonwealth procured drugs at the same price as states managed to get it, we'd save about $1.3 billion a year. Same for medical devices. So procurement has been a failure here, really, apart from the Astra vaccine where we're producing it locally.
So, Katie Gallagher, Labor is making a lot of noise about the vaccine rollout. What would you be doing differently if you were doing this? It's a phenomenally difficult task.
Well, I think there's a couple of things. So from, I think, early last year when negotiations started, Labor was urging the government to get as many deals as they could in place back in the early days of the vaccine. So have a diversified vaccination strategy to begin with. Don't put all your eggs in the AstraZeneca basket, which is, aside from the relatively small deal they had with Pfizer, which they've now doubled, was where all the effort went. And we'd been certainly urging them that. Before the committee, we'd been told many times there was no need for that. Our vaccine strategy was fine. It was going to meet the needs of the community. It's turned out that's not the case, clearly. Look, and I think the other issue we've got is how the government, and I agree a lot with what Norman said. I was a former health minister in a state jurisdiction or a territory jurisdiction, so I get the fact that the Commonwealth does not tend to be very good at delivering services on the ground. And they have taken a decision very early on that they would assume responsibility for aged care, disability services and run the program through GPs, and with a bit of assistance from the states that would be enough. Clearly that has failed. They set themselves targets of 4 million by the end of March, everyone vaccinated by the end of October. Then it got wound back to a one shot by the end of October. Then it was get our aged care done in 6 weeks. Clearly that's not the case. We have no idea what's happening in disability services. So I think confidence in the program from the public has been challenged because every promise the government's made has not been delivered, and that is a problem as well. Now, we've had the Prime Minister come out and blame the states that they're stockpiling vaccine and not distributing it fast enough. So we've seen this before where the blame tries to get shifted, and now we're going to have 2 national cabinets a week and that's going to solve everything. Well, clearly the Commonwealth has failed and we need a lot better effort, because if the vaccine rollout fails, then the economic recovery fails, on top of putting vulnerable populations and the health of our population at risk. And that's not good enough. And the Prime Minister has promised things and he's not delivered.
Hamish, Katie admitted some... Hamish, Katie has admitted some other advice that the Labor Party has offered the government on vaccines, which we didn't take up, and it's a good thing we didn't follow their advice. In a radio interview last week and another one this week, Anthony Albanese said the Australian government should have bought the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and it was a disgrace that we hadn't done so. Well, actually, the expert medical advice we received at the time was that we shouldn't get it because it was very similar to the AstraZeneca vaccine, and not less than 24 hours after Anthony Albanese did that second interview, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine in America was paused in its rollout because of blood clots. There is a real danger in following politicians' advice and commentators' advice and ignoring the expert medical advice. What we did about a year ago, when we didn't even know whether vaccines would be able to be produced successfully, let alone 3 or 4 of them, was bet on a range of different vaccines with a range of different technologies. Traditional technologies like AstraZeneca, new technologies like Pfizer,
Can we just be clear
vaccines.
and honest about this? It's not going well currently.
No. It's not.
Hamish, we're in a global pandemic, right? So we're going to encounter some challenges.
Sure.
And actually, I think if you look at the health outcomes in Australia or the economic outcomes that Katie's mentioned, we are leading the world. We've had some of the fewest infections, the fewest deaths, the best economic recovery.
That's incontrovertible. However,
thank you.
Another good example of poor procurement is this extra 20 million doses of Pfizer. Pfizer is going to be only too happy to give us whatever we want towards the end of this year, because they're not going to be immunising in the United States. And they've got no deal with Moderna. The issue at the end of this year are going to be the South African variant and the Brazilian variant. And what we need to be buying is vaccine that's designed for the new variants. And the leading vaccine for that is Moderna. So what the Prime Minister should have stood up and said last week was, we're negotiating to buy 50 million doses of Moderna, and so that we've got a variant vaccine. And the Commonwealth is not focusing on the variants.
Well, I don't think that's fair, and there are ongoing conversations with Moderna, as you would expect, and there should be. But the Novavax vaccine, which is in its trial still, but looking promising, is a similar style vaccine to the Moderna vaccine and may offer some similar benefits.
It's not. I'm sorry to correct you. It's a protein-based vaccine, whereas the Moderna is an mRNA similar to Pfizer. So the Novavax is a novel vaccine, very different, and it will be a very good vaccine, but it's not designed for the variant yet.
David, you first became the president of the Australia-China Business Council in November 2019. You accepted that role knowing the Chinese government was building concentration camps for Uyghurs and other Muslim ethnic minority groups in Xinjiang. Scholarly estimates put the number detained based on their Muslim faith at more than 1 million. The BBC has shown that rape and torture are systematic within these camps. The AP has shown the Chinese regime is suppressing the Uyghur birth rate with forced abortions and forced sterilizations. This all meets the definition of genocide under international law. So my question to you is simple. How, in good conscience, can you continue to advocate business with China while this terrible genocide takes place?
David Olsen.
Thanks, Drew. Well, look, it's really a very difficult question to be able to answer that clearly. You know, the issues that we're seeing in Xinjiang are shocking, and you know, the problem we have at the moment is we don't have journalists on the ground. We have very little direct information about what's happening there. Now, I think most of us would genuinely believe that you know there are serious issues that need to be addressed. Our government has looked at this. It's not used the same language of genocide that other governments have used around the world in recent times. The UK, Canada parliaments have recently passed specific legislation using that term genocide. The Australian government has decided not to use that language, but have condemned in very clear terms what's going on in those nations.
Do you believe it's genocide?
I don't. Well, I haven't. Genocide is a technical term that needs to be defined. Under
it is a technical term, but the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says it's exactly the right description.
Right. It is a term that you know is clearly something that you know we need to be really concerned about in terms of what is actually going on there. You know, what I'm more concerned about is the fact that we just need to verify the information first of all, and I don't believe that there's much that we need to prove, but we do need to get people in there. United Nations have said that they are in close discussions now with the Chinese government to allow free and unfettered access to the Xinjiang province to review that. I think that's a really helpful sign. In the meantime, I think the most important thing we can be doing is to continue to advocate the principles that we believe in around human rights.
I'm not sure if I'm clear on your answer to that. Vicky Xu, is it genocide in Xinjiang?
The US government, the government in the Netherlands and Canada have all recognized the Uyghur crisis to be genocide. Now, Australia is in the unfortunate company of Turkey. Australia and Turkey are the only two countries in the world that have had a vote to decide if this is genocide and decided no. And so my personal belief is Australia has decided not to call this genocide, not because the crimes are not severe enough, but because economic considerations. So I think the question really is, how much do we Australians want to stand up for our beliefs? How much do we want to stand up for our values? And at what cost? Because as some of the audience here would know that I have been enduring the smear campaign for a month. The Chinese state has called me a female demon for writing about forced labor in Xinjiang and generally in China. So for business, the problem is, right, the Chinese state is facilitating, arranging a forced labor scheme targeting Uyghurs. And as a result, businesses have been implicated, supply chains have been implicated. And when businesses are trying to move out of China or trying to steer clear of forced labor, when they make promises to the world, to their consumers that they will be ethical, they face backlash in China. So businesses, if they want to respect, if they want to adhere to international law, modern slavery law in their own countries, they could not operate in China. So that's the situation we're in now.
Just on the personal story you mentioned, what has happened to you over the last month or so?
I was lynched in the Chinese media, along with a lot of my peers who study Xinjiang.
Your name was like top trending on the Chinese version of Twitter for a while.
Yeah. So a year ago, last March, me and my colleagues at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and our colleagues from the Washington Post Beijing Bureau, we did a collaboration. We wrote about forced labor and went to a Nike factory and identified forced labor clues. And we wrote a report and named 83 brands that have been implicated with forced labor in their supply chains. And a year later, because there has been legislations, there has been companies pulling out of China. So now the Chinese government, in an attempt to rescue its reputation, to defend its actions regarding Xinjiang, has decided to go on the offensive, and they've done two things. The first is encouraging and partially facilitating popular protests in China to endorse Xinjiang cotton, which has now become a symbol of Uyghur forced labor. And two, a smear campaign targeting people like myself. My other colleagues who do work on Xinjiang have been accused of rape. And I have been called so many names, and last night when I was eating at a Chinese restaurant with a friend, I felt uneasy and I was being stared at, and it's a difficult time.
You're being followed here? Or monitored?
In the past 8 months, people close to me who still live in China have been targeted by Chinese intelligence operatives. People close to me have been interrogated repeatedly, detained. They're paying a price for me to tell the truth here.
Okay. So if the truth is that it's genocide, James Patterson, why don't we call it that?
Well, Hamish, I was banned from visiting China in part because I've been outspoken about these issues.
So do you call it genocide?
I think it's very hard to look at Vicky's research and the research for former colleagues at ASPI or Human Rights Watch or any of these other groups that have done it and conclude anything else. The reason why the Australian government hasn't declared it is not because of some judgment about trade or economics. It's because the Australian government has a long-standing policy that a genocide declaration is a legal declaration and a court should do that, not governments and not politicians. But I'm happy to say it sure looks like it to me.
So why is it hard for our foreign minister to say that, though?
Well, to be fair, our Foreign Minister's been one of the most outspoken foreign ministers internationally on these issues, and she's called for the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights to have access to Xinjiang so that they can collect evidence to help make this determination. And the Chinese government's unwillingness to allow them in speaks volumes, as does, frankly, the campaign of harassment they've launched against Vicky and her colleagues internationally. Why on earth would you do that if you didn't have something to hide? David Olsen, how do you respond to this?
Well, I think it's shocking in terms of what's happened to Vicky and her colleagues. That it's disgraceful. One of the problems we've got is I think China is undertaking a propaganda campaign around the world that's completely misjudged global sentiment around these issues. The exercise the other day with the Chinese ambassador, who's a very bright chap, and
You're referring to a press conference that was held where they zoomed in people from Xinjiang.
That's right. He was clearly on instructions to represent the Chinese case for that, but it completely misread the mood of the Australian public and the broader community. And I think it's done nothing but further polarise views around the issue. And unfortunately, that's made it very hard to have a sensible conversation about this. And I think the issue is fairly clear-cut as to how we need to act.
Well, that is all we've got time for tonight. A huge thanks to our wonderful panel, Vicky Xu, James Patterson, David Olsen, Katie Gallagher and Dr. Norman Swan. Please thank all of them.